So if you formulate a moisturizer, right, and you put it in a jar and slap a label on it that says, clinically proven to cure your sunburn, you have, in the eyes of the federal government, just manufactured an illegal, unapproved drug.
Oh,
They're
absolutely.
looking at warning letters, massive fines, maybe even a potential shutdown. But if you take that exact same formulation, I mean, the exact same chemical composition down to the molecule, put it in the exact same jar, and just change the label to read, an after-sun soothing balm to promote a radiant glow, congratulations,
hmm
you have just manufactured a legally compliant cosmetic.
It's a stunning paradox, honestly. I mean, the exact same physical substance interacting with the exact same human skin cells, but governed by completely different regulatory universes.
Hmm.
And it's based entirely on, well, a few words printed on a piece of cardboard.
Yeah, it's wild. Welcome to the deep dive, everyone. We are jumping straight into the deep end today. We're looking at the Handbook of Cosmetic Science and Technology, the one edited by Beryl, Pei, and Maibach.
A classic text.
Right. And if you are listening to this, you're likely a junior product developer, a formulation chemist, or, a regulatory specialist. You already know what a surfactant is. You definitely know what the stratum corneum is.
Exactly. We aren't doing 101 level definitions today.
No, not at all. We are going straight into the murky, highly complex, billion-dollar gray area where advanced human biology crashes headfirst into strict federal law and consumer psychology.
And that gray area is exactly why modern cosmetology is so utterly fascinating. I mean, prior to the late 1930s, the cosmetics industry was largely about, frankly, just selling dreams.
Snake oil, basically.
Yeah, exactly. There was very little science, almost no oversight, and in some tragic cases, active harm to consumers. But today, it is a highly rigorous, multidisciplinary science. You cannot formulate a successful product today by just, mixing nice-smelling oils in a vat.
Right.
You have to be part pharmacologist, part physical chemist, and quite profoundly part psychologist.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the mission today is a bit different. We are acting as your pedagogical coaches for this deep dive. We're treating this like a master class.
I love that approach.
Yeah. So for each core theme, which we'll just treat as chapters in our master class, we are going to break down the material using a strict, highly scannable format.
Right, to keep it actionable.
Exactly. We'll give you the big idea, an advanced deep dive into the mechanics, the connective tissue linking it together, a practical recap, and finally, a critical thinking challenge for you to apply to your own bench work.
Sounds perfect.
So, are you ready? Let's start with Chapter 1. The big idea here is that a product's classification as a cosmetic, a drug, or a cosmeceutical is dictated not just by its biological activity, but fundamentally by its legally defined intended use and the regional regulatory frameworks.
And that sunburn example you just gave, that is the absolute bedrock of how this entire industry functions in the U.S. It's known as the intended use doctrine.
So let's get into the advanced deep dive for Chapter 1. Where does this doctrine actually come from?
Well, if we trace this back to the United States statutory foundation, specifically the FD&C Act of 1938, Section 201, the legal definition of a cosmetic is entirely based on intended use.
Right.
The statute defines cosmetics as articles intended to be rubbed, poured, sprinkled, or sprayed on, introduced into, or otherwise applied to the human body for cleansing, beautifying, promoting attractiveness, or altering the appearance.
I always think of it like a software terms of service agreement.
Oh, that's an interesting way to look at it.
Yeah, because it honestly doesn't matter what the underlying code, like the actual chemical formula, can theoretically do. It matters what you legally claim it does on the front end. I mean, the verbs in that 1938 definition are so physical and, well, superficial.
Rubbed, poured, beautifying.
Exactly. There is zero mention of cellular alteration or metabolic pathways.
And the FDA takes the determination of that intended use incredibly seriously. It's not a loophole you can just casually slip through. A lot of junior developers assume that as long as they don't explicitly print the word cure or treat on the label, they're safe.
But they're not, are they?
No, not at all. The FDA looks at the total ecosystem of the product. They look at the historical use of your key ingredients. If you put an ingredient in your product that has only ever been used historically to treat eczema, the FDA might flag it as a drug, regardless of your clever marketing.
Wow.
Yeah, and they look at your advertising, your social media, and crucially, consumer perception. What does a reasonable consumer actually believe your product is doing based on the totality of your presentation?
So if you have, like, An influencer on TikTok claiming your soothing balm cured their clinical rosacea, and you repost that video on your brand's official page.
You've just adopted a drug claim. Your cosmetic is now an unapproved drug.
That alters your entire business model overnight.
It really does. But, the cosmetic regulatory pathway in the U.S. is incredibly fast, precisely because it lacks mandatory pre-market approval. You don't have to spend 10 years and hundreds of millions of dollars on phase 3 clinical trials like a pharmaceutical company does.
Right, which is huge for startups.
Exactly. But that speed requires you to stay strictly within the cosmetic sandbox.
Which brings up a really interesting hypothetical. Let's say I'm formulating an AHA creamback and alpha hydroxy acid. I'm a chemist. I know for a biological fact that this specific concentration of glycolic acid is going to penetrate the epidermis, unglue the desmosomes, and drastically increase cellular turnover.
It absolutely will.
Right. It is biologically altering the structure and function of the skin. So how on earth do I legally market that in the U.S. without the FDA kicking down my door for selling an unapproved drug?
You focus entirely on the aesthetic outcome, not the biological mechanism.
Okay.
You cannot say increases epidermal cell turnover. You say reveals brighter, fresher-looking skin.
Ah, I see.
You are claiming the appearance of the skin is altered, which fits perfectly into the beautifying definition of the 1938 Act. You are allowing the biological mechanism to happen silently in the background while your legal claims sit firmly on the superficial cosmetic surface.
That is such a fine line to walk. But, the lack of pre-market approval doesn't mean it's the Wild West out there.
Not at all.
The FDA operates on a post-market surveillance system. They're watching for misbranding, which we just talked about, but they are also aggressively watching for adulteration. And looking at the data in the handbook, this is where a lot of formulators get tripped up.
Yes, the recall data is sobering.
It is. Between fiscal years 1996 and 1999, 88% of FDA voluntary recalls for cosmetics weren't for rogue, illegal drug ingredients.
Yeah.
They were for microbiological contamination.
That statistic should be taped to the wall of every formulation lab in the world, 88%. It usually isn't the exotic botanical extract from the Amazon that causes a catastrophic recall.
Right.
It is a basic fundamental failure to preserve the water phase of the emulsion. When you create an aqueous environment, you are creating a perfect breeding ground for bacteria, yeast, and mold. If your preservation system fails, your product is legally adulterated, and the FDA will pull it immediately.
Because the U.S. relies so heavily on post-market surveillance, the industry has had to build massive self-regulatory structures, right? Just to keep the government from stepping in and mandating pre-market approval.
Precisely. Things like the VCRP, the Voluntary Cosmetic Registration Program, and the CIR, the Cosmetic Ingredient Review Panel.
Let's talk about the CIR, because that seems really important.
The CIR is vital to understand. It's an independent, industry-funded scientific body that thoroughly reviews the safety of cosmetic ingredients and publishes their findings in peer-reviewed journals.
Now, some critics look at that and say, well, it's industry-funded, it must be biased.
Sure, that's a common critique. But the reality is quite the opposite. The industry knows that if the CIR loses its scientific credibility, or if dangerous products start flooding the market, the FDA will have no choice but to step in and dismantle the post-market system entirely.
So the self-regulation has to be incredibly strict, almost draconian specifically, to protect their freedom from those pre-market mandates. Which actually makes me want to push back a bit on the U.S. system. Why do we force everything into this strict binary of cosmetic or drug? When you look at the global landscape, specifically Japan, they handle this completely differently.
Japan is a fascinating contrast. Historically, under their pharmaceutical affairs law, they operate on a much stricter pre-market approval system.
Yeah.
You cannot just formulate a product, launch it, and wait to see if anyone reports an adverse reaction.
But they also have this incredible middle ground category called quasi-drugs.
Yes, the quasi-drug category.
These are products with a mild action on the body. We're talking about medicated dentifrices, hair growers, specialized anti-acne preparations. It perfectly encapsulates that biological gray area we were just talking about with the AHA cream.
It does.
So why doesn't the U.S. just adopt a quasi-drug category? It seems so much more scientifically honest than forcing an active biological product to masquerade as a superficial cosmetic.
It's a debate that rages constantly in regulatory circles. The argument against it in the U.S. is largely economic and bureaucratic.
Yes.
Well, creating a third regulatory tier, the much-discussed cosmeceutical category, would require a massive legislative overhaul of the FDA's mandate. It would require a new division, new enforcement mechanisms, and it would likely slow down the speed to market that the U.S. beauty industry absolutely relies on.
So it's about speed and money.
Largely, yes. The U.S. system essentially says, as long as it is proven safe and you don't make medical claims, we will let the consumer decide if it works. Interestingly, though, the text notes that Japan has actually been gradually shifting toward deregulation.
Really?
Yes, they're harmonizing slightly more with the Western post-market approach, rather than the U.S. shifting toward Japan's pre-market model.
That is fascinating. Okay, so that brings us to the connective tissue. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the legal framework strictly limits what a cosmetic is allowed to do, but biology doesn't read the FD&C Act.
No, it certainly doesn't.
This leads us directly to how these products actually interact with the human body. So let's do the practical recap for Chapter 1. 1. Regulatory classification hinges on intended use via labeling, history, and consumer perception. 2. The U.S. operates on post-market self-regulation using tools like the CIR, while markets like Japan utilize specific pre-market categories like quasi-drugs. And 3. Microbiological contamination is the leading cause of product adulteration and recalls.
Perfect summary.
And now, your critical thinking challenge for Chapter 1. First, if you formulate a highly effective AHA cream that demonstrably alters cell turnover, how do you legally market it in the US versus Japan without crossing into drug territory? And second, how does industry self-regulation protect manufacturers from strict FDA pre-market mandates?
Good questions to mull over.
Right. Ready for the next one? Let's move to Chapter 2. The big idea here is that the skin is a highly dynamic living biomembrane that actively metabolizes cosmetic ingredients, intertwining physiological realities with deep psychological impacts.
This is where the science gets really beautiful.
So let's jump into the advanced deep dive. We have this strict legal framework that forces us to pretend that cosmetics just sit inertly on the surface of the skin. But the Handbook has a whole section on percutaneous absorption that completely shatters that idea.
For a very long time, the prevailing myth in dermatology and cosmetology was that the skin was basically an impenetrable barrier.
Like a brick wall.
Exactly. The stratum corneum, that outermost layer of dead, keratinized skin cells, was viewed as a brick wall that nothing could get through. The assumption was that cosmetics just sat on top of the bricks, provided some moisture, and eventually washed off.
But the data in the Handbook completely obliterates that myth. The skin is not a static shield, and here's where it gets really interesting. The Handbook provides a specific documented example using hydroquinone, which is a common skin lightening agent.
A very potent one, yes.
Right. When you apply pure hydroquinone to in vivo living human skin for 24 hours, the absorption rate is 45%.
Just let that sink in for a second. Nearly half of the applied dose doesn't just sit on the surface, it penetrates deep into the barrier.
Wait, almost half of it goes completely through the barrier. That entirely contradicts the legal definition we just talked about in Chapter 1.
It does.
If 45% of an active chemical is penetrating the stratum corneum, diving into the viable epidermis, and potentially reaching the dermis, we are absolutely causing a physiological change.
We are. The chemical is transversing from the highly lipophilic, lipid-rich environment of the stratum corneum down into the progressively more hydrophilic, water-rich environments of the deeper living tissue. But, penetration is only half the story here.
Right, there's more.
The truly disruptive realization is that the skin is metabolically active.
Yes, it doesn't just passively absorb the hydroquinone like a sponge. The enzymes in the viable epidermis actually grab that hydroquinone molecule and actively metabolize it into a completely different compound, benzoquinone.
Which changes everything about how we calculate safety in toxicology. If you are a toxicologist evaluating the safety of a new face cream, the applied concentration of the active agent in the jar is practically irrelevant.
Really?
Irrelevant. Essentially, yes. It doesn't matter that you put, say, 2% hydroquinone in the formula. What matters is the bioavailability. How much of it actually permeates the barrier? How long does it stay in the viable tissue? And crucially, what secondary metabolites is the skin generating from it?
So if I'm a formulation chemist and I discover a brand new, highly effective botanical extract in the Amazon rainforest, I can't just test the extract itself for toxicity.
No, because that's not what's actually interacting with the living cells.
Right, I have to figure out what the human skin is going to metabolize that extract into, because the metabolite might be 10 times more toxic than the parent compound. Or conversely, I guess, the skin might metabolize my super expensive active ingredient into something completely inert before it ever reaches its target cell.
Exactly. Rendering your product totally useless. This metabolic reality completely blurs the line between cosmetic and drug. From a biochemical standpoint, we are operating in a profound gray area. We are delivering active molecules into living tissue where they are biochemically transformed.
But while the formulation chemists and the toxicologists are hyper-focused on benzoquinone metabolites in the viable epidermis, the marketing team and the consumer are operating in a completely different reality.
They really are.
And this is a dynamic that the handbook captures brilliantly with Dr. Jürgen Serup's model, the psyche skin product triangle.
This is one of the most elegant frameworks for understanding the cosmetic industry. Dr. Serup points out that the consumer applying your night cream does not care about the electrical conduction of their stratum corneum.
No, they definitely don't.
They do not care about the micrometer width of their periorbital rhytides. Those are biophysical metrics for the lab. The consumer is pursuing a psychological state.
I look at this exactly like UI/UX design in software development.
Oh, how so?
Well, as a user of an app, I don't care how elegant your backend Python code is. I don't care how your database is structured. If the front-end interface is clunky, slow, or ugly, I am deleting the app. In cosmetics, the biological mechanism, the percutaneous absorption, the active metabolites, that is the back-end code. The front-end interface is the sensory experience of applying the product.
That is a brilliant analogy. The slip of the emulsion, the cooling sensation on the skin, the specific fragrance profile, the weight of the glass jar in their hand. These physical realities trigger a deep psychological response.
Right, it's a ritual.
Exactly. The consumer is looking for a moment of relaxation, a sense of luxury, or a tangible boost in self-esteem. The psychological ritual of application is just as vital to the product's commercial success as the biological outcome.
There is a quote from a French researcher in the text that I think perfectly nails this dual reality. He says, "Cosmetic products do less than we say, but more than we think."
I've always loved that quote. They do less biologically than the aggressive marketing claims suggest. They aren't going to make you look 20 years younger overnight.
Right.
But they do far more psychologically, and as we just saw with the hydroquinone metabolism, far more metabolically than we historically believed.
So let's put this into a real-world scenario. Let's say I'm launching a new daily moisturizer. I need to design a product and a marketing claim that satisfies the strict biological reality of the stratum corneum, stays within the legal intended use doctrine so the FDA doesn't seize it, and still fulfills the psychological daydream of the consumer. How do you thread that needle?
You focus the formulation on creating an immediate sensory impact.
Like what?
Perhaps a high molecular weight hyaluronic acid that sits on the surface and instantly plumps the skin via hydration. That gives the consumer that immediate psychological gratification. But deeper in the vehicle, you encapsulate a slow-release antioxidant that actually penetrates to the viable epidermis to provide long-term protection against free radicals.
Okay, so you have the front end and the back end working together.
Precisely. And legally, your claim focuses entirely on the superficial, instantly quenches and visibly smooths for a radiant morning glow. You are selling the psychological daydream, you are legally compliant, but you are still delivering legitimate biological efficacy on the back end.
That is incredible. Okay, so for our connective tissue transitioning out of Chapter 2, if the skin is a living metabolizing barrier and the consumer demands both biological and psychological satisfaction, how do we actually get the ingredients where they need to go? That sets up Chapter 3.
It's all about the delivery.
Exactly. But first, the practical recap for Chapter 2. 1. Skin is not a static shield. It actively absorbs and metabolizes cosmetic chemicals, like turning hydroquinone into benzoquinone. 2. Bioavailability, not just applied concentration, is the critical metric for safety and risk assessment. 3. Product efficacy is governed by the psyche skin product triangle. The psychological ritual is as vital as the biological outcome. And the critical thinking challenge for you listeners. First, how should a formulation chemist account for in vivo skin metabolism when calculating the safety profile of a new botanical extract? And second, design a marketing claim for a moisturizer that satisfies both the biological reality of the stratum corneum and the psychological daydream of the consumer.
I'd love to read the answers to those.
Right, okay, got all that. Next up, Chapter 3. The big idea here is that the cosmetic vehicle is not just a passive carrier, but an active participant that dictates the release rate, targeting, and aesthetic success of the product.
This is where the physical chemistry really shines.
So for the advanced deep dive, we have to fundamentally rethink what a vehicle is. It is not just a dumb delivery truck that dumps ingredients onto the skin.
No, not at all. The cosmetic vehicle is an active, structural participant in the formulation. When most people think of a vehicle, they categorize it by how it looks. Is it a liquid, lotion, a thick cream? But as formulators, we have to look at the physicochemical structure.
Like aerosols, colloidal systems, suspensions.
Exactly, and the absolute titan of the industry, the emulsion. Emulsions, specifically oil and water and oil systems, are the workhorses of cosmetic science.
Mm.
But from a purely physical chemistry standpoint, they are inherently unnatural.
Right, because oil and water hate each other.
They do. You are taking two substances that fundamentally thermodynamically repel each other, and you are forcing them to coexist in a single space.
The universe actively wants them to separate. Left to their own devices, the oil droplets will rapidly crash together, coalesce, and float to the top. To prevent that, to maintain this metastable state, you have to use amphiphilic emulsifiers.
Amphiphilic, meaning they love both.
Right. I always visualize these emulsifiers as microscopic diplomats. One end of the molecule is hydrophilic, it loves water. The other end is lipophilic, it loves oil. So this diplomat wedges itself right at the boundary line, grabbing the oil with one hand and the water with the other, forming a protective barrier, a micelle around the droplet.
I love the diplomat analogy. And the specific type of diplomat you choose, the exact ratio of your emulsifiers, dictates how the vehicle will behave when it hits the heat and the salt of human skin. Advanced vehicles are engineered to break down at a very specific rate.
Give me an example.
Well, if you are delivering a water-soluble active like vitamin C, you might use a water in oil, in water, multiple emulsion.
A multiple emulsion,
Yeah.
so like a droplet inside a droplet.
Exactly. It protects the delicate active from oxidation in the jar, but allows it to release slowly over several hours once rubbed into the stratum corneum. And the targeting has to be incredibly precise. You want your active to reach the superficial viable epidermis to do its job, but you absolutely do not want it penetrating so deeply that it hits the dermal capillary bed and enters the bloodstream.
Because the second it goes systemic, you've crossed the line into pharmacology.
Precisely, which is a perfect segue into one of the most interesting delivery systems discussed in the handbook, cosmetic patches.
Now, I have to push back here. When I think of a patch, I think of a medical device.
Most people do.
Right. I think of a nicotine patch to quit smoking, or a transdermal estrogen patch. How is a patch a cosmetic? The entire mechanism seems inherently pharmaceutical.
It is a very fine line, and the distinction is crucial for regulatory compliance. You are correct that transdermal patches were pioneered by the pharmaceutical industry. But a pharma patch is designed to deliver a single, highly concentrated, highly potent active drug through the skin and directly into the systemic circulation to treat a specific illness.
Okay.
Cosmetic patches are entirely distinct. Legally, they can only use cosmetic ingredients at permitted non-systemic concentrations, and they can only make cosmetic claims.
But if they can't use highly potent drug concentrations, how do they actually do anything? I mean, a patch is expensive to manufacture. If it's just delivering the same weak cosmetic ingredients as a cream, why bother?
Because of occlusion. When you apply a patch, you create a localized, occlusive microenvironment on the skin. You trap the moisture that is naturally evaporating from the body, which hyperhydrates the stratum corneum. A hyperhydrated stratum corneum is significantly more permeable. Because cosmetic patches cannot legally rely on high concentrations of regulated drugs, the formulator has to be much smarter. They rely on complex cocktails of synergistically correct combinations.
So instead of one massive hammer, you're using a dozen tiny scalpels.
Exactly. You are relying on multiple mild ingredients, botanicals, peptides, mild humectant, working in concert under the intense occlusion of the patch to achieve a visible result, like reducing the appearance of under-eye dark circles.
That makes sense.
Furthermore, the physical engineering of a cosmetic patch is incredibly demanding. A cream just rubs in. A patch requires peel force testing. You have to engineer the adhesive so that it stays on all night, but when the consumer peels it off in the morning, it doesn't physically rip the fragile stratum corneum off with it.
Ouch. Yeah, that would be bad. But occlusion brings up a terrifying secondary issue: microbiology. We talked earlier about how 88% of FDA recalls are due to microbiological contamination. When you have an occlusive patch, or even just a thick water and oil emulsion, you are creating a wet, warm environment. You have water in the system, and where there is water, there is life.
Bacteria and fungi are incredibly resilient. They thrive at a pH of 5 to 8, which is exactly the pH range of most cosmetics, because that is what is comfortable for human skin.
Right.
But the key metric for formulators isn't just the total amount of water in a formula. It is the all-the-water activity.
This is such a critical concept. AW isn't the percentage of water on your ingredient list. It's the amount of free water available for microorganisms to actually drink and use for cellular division.
Yeah.
You could have a formula that is 70% water, but if all of that water is chemically bound to other molecules, the bacteria will dehydrate and die.
So how do we manipulate that? If you want to create a safer, self-preserving system, you lower the A, you add high levels of humectants like glycerin or sorbitol, which act like molecular sponges, binding up all the free water, or you shift the pH slightly outside that comfortable 5 to 8 range.
Let me throw another scenario at you. Let's say I want to formulate a totally clean, standard oil and water emulsion. Marketing says we cannot use any traditional regulated antimicrobial chemicals, no parabens, no phenoxyethanol. How do I physically manipulate the physicochemical properties of this emulsion to make it entirely self-preserving?
It requires extreme precision. First, you drop the free water activity drastically. You load the water phase with heavy humectants, glycols, and glycerin. Then you use specific packaging like an airless pump so the consumer never touches the bulk product with their contaminated fingers.
Keeping the environment sterile.
Exactly. Finally, you might use multifunctional ingredients, certain botanical extracts, or specific glycols like caprylglycol. These are officially categorized as skin conditioning agents, but coincidentally happen to severely disrupt bacterial cell membranes.
It's chemical sleight of hand. You are preserving the system without technically using a preservative as defined by older regulatory lists.
Exactly. But even when traditional chemical preservatives are necessary, the text makes it clear that chemists rarely rely on just one. It's too dangerous to rely on a single chemical to fight off the entire microbial kingdom. You use synergistic mixtures.
Like combining parabens with something else?
Yes, a classic example is combining parabens, which are fantastic against fungi, with something like imidazolinylurea, which is a powerhouse against bacteria. Together, they broaden the spectrum of protection while allowing you to lower the total overall concentration of preservatives in the jar, which reduces the risk of irritating the skin.
And irritation is the ultimate bottleneck, right? Which brings us to our connective tissue for this section. What's fascinating here is that the more sophisticated our delivery systems become, like these highly occlusive cosmetic patches or advanced liposomal emulsions, the higher the risk we run of trapping irritants against the skin or triggering adverse reactions. Which brings us to our final chapter.
It's a double-edged sword. Better delivery means a higher chance of delivering an irritant.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's do the practical recap for Chapter 3. 1. Vehicles perform 5 main effects: cleansing, decoration, care, hydration, and targeted delivery. 2. Cosmetic patches represent a breakthrough delivery system utilizing synergistic cocktails rather than single high-dose pharmaceutical actives. And 3. Microbiological stability can be achieved not just through chemical preservatives, but by manipulating the formulation's pH and water availability, the AW.
Beautifully summarized.
And the critical thinking challenge. First, if you are developing an overnight cosmetic patch for dark circles, how do you balance the need for potent ingredient delivery with the regulatory restriction against systemic pharmacological action? And second, how would you manipulate the physicochemical properties of an OW emulsion to make it self-preserving without adding traditional antimicrobials?
That second one is what every clean beauty formulator is trying to solve right now.
Absolutely. All right, let's bring it home. Next, Chapter 4. The big idea here is that proving a cosmetic's efficacy and safety requires navigating the complex intersection of objective biophysical measurements and highly subjective consumer perceptions.
This is where we have to prove that our brilliant chemistry doesn't actually hurt anyone.
Right, because all this elegant chemistry is utterly useless if it gives the consumer a rash. So for the advanced deep dive, let's define the spectrum of irritation, because it is not just one thing.
No, it's not. Irritation at its core is a non-immunological mediated inflammation. It is different from an allergic reaction, which involves the immune system creating specific antibodies.
Right.
Irritation ranges from objective, acute reactions, which are usually monofactorial, like spilling a strong acid or a harsh industrial detergent on the skin, to cumulative multifactorial chronic forms. And it is the chronic form that plagues the cosmetic industry.
This chronic low-level irritation leads to the massive phenomenon we call sensitive skin, right?
Yeah.
Which dermatologists often diagnose as cosmetic intolerance syndrome. And this is a nightmare for product developers because it is often completely invisible.
Exactly. Cosmetic intolerance syndrome is largely driven by sensory irritation. The consumer applies your new, expensive night cream, and they immediately feel a burning, stinging, or tight sensation. They go to their dermatologist, complaining that they're having a reaction. The dermatologist looks at the skin under a magnifying lamp, and there is absolutely no visible erythema.
So no redness, no swelling, no scaling.
Nothing. Clinically, there is nothing to see.
So the patient is in discomfort, the product is being returned, but clinically there is zero evidence. How do you measure something that is functionally invisible? I mean, how do you prove to your lab that your new preservative system is causing this if you can't even see the damage?
You have to step away from visual grading and move into objective biophysical measurement. And the gold standard for this is evaluating TEWL, transepidermal water loss.
Let's explain how this actually works. I want you to imagine the stratum corneum, that top layer of skin, as a brick wall. The dead skin cells are the bricks, and the complex lipids holding them together are the mortar.
Good analogy.
If your skin is perfectly healthy, that wall is sealed tight, keeping the water inside your body from evaporating into the dry air. But if an ingredient in your cosmetic, like a harsh surfactant, starts eating away at the lipid mortar between the bricks, water starts escaping. It's exactly like heat leaking out of a poorly insulated house in the winter. You can't see the heat leaking with your naked eye, but if you point a thermal camera at the house, it lights up bright red. A TEWL instrument is that thermal camera.
It's a perfect analogy. TEWL instruments, like the evaporimeter or the thermometer, are highly sensitive probes placed on the skin that measure the exact microgradient of water vapor escaping through the stratum corneum. If your new cosmetic formula is causing subclinical irritation, meaning it is quietly damaging the lipid barrier but hasn't yet triggered a visible red inflammatory response, the TEWL machine will show a massive spike in water loss.
It provides undeniable objective data for a subjective complaint. It allows a chemist to detect barrier damage weeks before the human eye can even see the redness. If a prototype formulation spikes the TEWL reading on a human patch test, you kill the formula before it ever reaches production, saving millions in potential recalls.
But sensory irritation and barrier disruption are only half the battle. We also have to evaluate how the vehicle interacts with the hair follicle. We have to test for comatogenicity and acnogenicity. And it is crucial to understand that these are not the same biological mechanism.
They are completely different, and consumers conflate them all the time. Comatogenesis is the slow, chronic formation of microcomedones, blackheads, and whiteheads. It is an insidious plugging of the follicle by hyperkeratosis, where dead skin cells get stuck together by the cosmetic vehicle. Acnogenicity, on the other hand, is a rapid, acute inflammatory response. You put a product on, and 48 hours later, you have painful red papules and pustules.
Historically, the industry tested for comatogenicity by rubbing ingredients on the inner ears of rabbits. But the anatomy is too different, and thankfully, we've moved past that. The gold standard discussed in the handbook is the human testing model pioneered by Mills and Kligman.
This test is wild and, frankly, a little visceral. To objectively prove that a cosmetic ingredient causes blackheads, you don't just ask the panelists to look in the mirror. You apply the test materials to the human back under highly occlusive patches. You leave those patches on for 28 continuous days, forcing the material into the follicle.
And then comes the extraction.
Yeah, this part is crazy.
To actually quantify the comedones, the clinical researcher applies cyanoacrylate glue, literally industrial superglue, to a glass slide. They press that slide firmly onto the test site on the panelist's back, let it cure, and then rip it off.
You are literally ripping off the top layer of the stratum corneum along with all the follicular plugs. It pulls the blackheads right out of the pores, stuck permanently to the glue.
You then place that glass slide under a microscope, and a trained technician literally counts the number of microcomedones per square centimeter. It is intensely physical, but it removes all subjectivity. You are looking at undeniable physical evidence of follicular impaction.
Okay, let's test this with a real-world scenario. You are running a 6-week consumer usage test for a newly formulated cream cleanser. In week 3, 5 of your panelists call in and say, "Your cleanser is breaking me out, it's highly cometogenic." How do you scientifically determine if the product is truly causing comatogenesis, or if it is merely causing a rapid follicular irritation acnogenicity from the surfactants?
You look at the timeline and the morphology of the lesions. True comatogenesis takes weeks to develop because it requires the slow accumulation of dead skin cells in the pore. If they are breaking out within days and the lesions are primarily inflammatory red papules rather than solid whiteheads or blackheads, the cleanser isn't plugging the pores.
It's stripping them.
Exactly. The surfactant is likely penetrating the follicle, stripping the lipid lining, and triggering an acute inflammatory immune response. Diagnostically, it is an irritancy problem, not a comatogenicity problem.
Yeah.
You don't need to remove your heavy emollients. You need to choose a milder surfactant system.
This level of diagnostic precision is exactly what you need when you sit down to substantiate your marketing claims. Because you cannot just say whatever you want on a billboard. Your claims have to be backed by robust data.
And the handbook categorizes these claims into 4 distinct buckets: physical or chemical claims like pH balanced, sensory claims like feels non-greasy, safety claims like hypoallergenic or dermatologist tested, and objective efficacy claims like reduces the appearance of wrinkles by 20%.
And here is where marketers get themselves into massive legal and competitive trouble. The absolute claim.
The absolute claim is a complete death trap. An absolute claim is something like the mildest baby wash on the market or provides 100% total UV protection.
Why is that so dangerous?
Well, if you claim your product is mild, you only have to prove that it passes standard TEWL and patch testing against a placebo. But if you claim it is the mildest product on the market, you have just legally challenged every single competitor in existence.
Oh, wow.
A single competitor only needs to formulate one product, run it against yours on a twometer, and if their product shows just 1% less water loss than yours, your entire marketing campaign is factually false. You open yourself up to cease and desist letters, regulatory action, and massive class action lawsuits.
That is terrifying. Okay, so for the connective tissue here, synthesizing this entire masterclass. You start with the legal definition in Chapter 1. You respect the biological metabolism of the skin in Chapter 2. You engineer a precise delivery vehicle in Chapter 3. And finally, you use biometrics to legally prove it all works without irritation here in Chapter 4.
It is a phenomenal interconnected matrix.
It really is. So, practical recap for Chapter 4. 1. Sensitive skin is often driven by invisible sensory irritation. Tools measuring TEWL are vital for detecting subclinical barrier damage. 2. Comatogenicity testing has moved from animal models to human models, utilizing 28-day occlusive patching and cyanoacrylate glue extraction. And 3. Claims must be rigorously supported by biophysical data, and absolute claims carry the highest regulatory and competitive risk.
Spot on.
And your final critical thinking challenge. First, a panelist in your usage test reports breakouts from your new cleanser. How do you scientifically determine if the product is cometogenic versus merely causing follicular irritation from surfactants? And second, design a substantiation strategy for a moisturizer claiming to repair the skin's lipid barrier using both objective TEWL measurements and subjective sensory questionnaires.
Those are fantastic exercises to run with your formulation team.
Definitely. Well, thank you for surviving this intense graduate-level deep dive into cosmetal science.
Before we go, though, I want to leave the listener with one final, deeply provocative thought that builds on everything we've discussed today.
Oh, absolutely. Lay it on us.
Throughout this deep dive, we talked extensively about how the human skin is not an inert shield. We know human enzymes metabolize ingredients like hydroquinone into benzoquinone, but the biological horizon is rapidly expanding. We are entering the era of the human microbiome.
Right, the bacteria living on our skin.
Exactly. We now know that the stratum corneum is covered in millions of bacteria, fungi, and mites, a vast living microecology. We spend all our time formulating to prevent microbiological contamination inside the jar. But what happens when our complex emulsions, our synergistic cocktails, and our chemical preservatives are applied to the living ecosystem on the human face?
Wow.
How do these millions of bacteria interact with our vehicles? Do they metabolize our botanical extracts before the human skin ever gets a chance to? Do they weaponize our preservatives?
That is a staggering question. I mean, are we actually formulating for human skin cells, or are we really just formulating food and toxins for the bacterial ecology that sits on top of it? The intended use doctrine certainly doesn't have a legal definition for altering the appearance of your microecology.
Not yet, anyway. And that is exactly where the next decade of cosmetic science and regulatory battles will take place. The diagnostic muddy waters are only going to get deeper.
It really takes us right back to that initial expectation of precision. We want this industry to be like like structural engineering. We want an ingredient list to be a clean binary equation. But the reality of human biology, the microbiome, and the ever-shifting regulatory environment means we are always going to be swimming in complexity.
Which is what makes it so exciting.
Exactly. But hopefully, with the mechanisms and the analytical framework we unpack today, those waters are just a little bit easier to navigate. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly deep dive into the source material. We encourage you to take these concepts, the TEWL thermal camera, the intended use paradox, the Psyche Skin UI/UX reality, and apply them directly to the very next formula you put on your bench. Keep formulating, keep questioning the mechanics, and we will catch you on the next deep dive.